So it's time for us to look into post-processing. Now, post-processing is one of those things that everyone knows they have to do, but they don't quite know what they're doing. They just kind of tweak numbers until they get something, also known as game development. Uh, what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up post-process, and I'm going to drop this into the map. Now, when I drop this into the map, it drops in a cube that looks like this. Now, the thing with the post-process is it essentially gives your screen certain overrides and tells it to handle certain visuals in different ways. This means that in theory, I can set up two post-processors next to one another and actually have it so that as I move through the map, one room is shown differently to another. Now, I'll give you an example of that. If I click on one of them and I go to settings, and just as my quick example, I'm going to go scene color, and I'm going to set my scene color to be blue. That'll do. And then on this one, I'm going to set my scene color to be like that. When I'm inside of this post-process, my world looks like this. When I'm inside this post-process, my world looks like this. So these values are actually changing how the environment looks. Now, I'm going to remove one of these because for this project, I basically want things to look pretty consistent. One thing that you might want to do if you were to work on this in the future would be if you ever wanted this doorway to open and people could exit out into that area, it might be a good idea to have a post-process that's like the outside post-process and the inside post-process that you could tweak things differently. But for the time being, this is a good enough position for us to start. Now, since we're only going to have one, post-processors have a nice little feature that instead of having to wrap around the entire level, I can just click this button that says Unbound. And you'll notice that the second I clicked Unbound, the bounds of the post-process no longer mattered at all. No matter where I am in the map right now, I'm going to see the same thing. So I'm going to uncheck scene color because that was not what I wanted for my final scene. And instead, I'm going to start looking at some of the values that we do want to tweak. Now, the first of those is under white balance, you'll see temperature. Now, if I was to increase my temperature or decrease my temperature, you can see that we get this nice subtle tint in the scene. It's a good idea to go into game mode whenever you're modifying these things. But by increasing my temperature or decreasing, I can really change the entire mood of the scene in a subtle way. By default, it's set to 6,500, but if I crank it up just a little, so 7,003, we can end up, it feels like it's a much warmer day outside, and this, everything else is just that slightly nicer temperature to kind of complete the scene. Now, so white balance really does matter, and if you want to, you can also affect the white tint, which kind of does it a little bit more aggressively. I personally usually just play with the temperature and leave it about there. Color grading is something that we're not going to tinker with too much. Suffice to say, if I wanted to, I could really affect how the world is calculated by desaturating certain channels. Increasing contrast on certain channels is another strong thing, so I could end up with a scene that, look, it looks quite cool, but as far as ArcViz goes, it's not particularly great. That said, if you're ever after a scene where you're having a bit of a flashback memory kicking in, color grading settings here for saturation, contrast, and especially gamma and gain to kind of get that old filmic view for a memory works really, really well. It also means that things like your whites can blow out in a way nicer way to kind of suit a memory. That said, because that's not what we're doing, I'm going to uncheck these and I'm going to go into the next sections that matter. Now, the color grading for shadows, midtones, and highlights, I just used to control them in certain areas. So for instance, if I wanted to only desaturate the shadows of the scene, I could do so. So you can see here that that's only affecting the darker areas of the couch while everything else is staying unaffected. So that's how those work, and that's per channel. So I could do that with any of them and I would get a similar effect. I don't really want to tinker with that for this, but I'd like you to know exactly what you're looking at. Now, as far as film is concerned, film is pretty useful. It's used to simulate how a camera actually takes in footage, which means you can do a lot of stuff like crushing your shadows and your highlights and generally kind of mixing your channels a little bit. For this kind of stuff, it's way too in detail for me to really want to cover in this tutorial. So instead, we're going to look at some of the things that we do care about. You've already seen scene color, but the first one we're going to look at is bloom. Now, bloom is very, very useful. However, it's one of those things that people can kind of treat in a slightly obnoxious way. If I was to crank up bloom, you'd get this. How it works is anytime something on the screen is above the threshold lighting value, it's going to start to blur it out and create a nice highlight. So if I set bloom to 0, the scene looks like this. I'm just going to stare at this light as my example. If I set bloom to 0, it looks like this. If I crank it to 5, it's now making it super bright and pushing out. And if I look around the world, I can see that same thing. And keep in mind, it's not just from the lighting. It's also in situations like this where it's kind of bouncing out. So the indirect lighting is causing these to bloom out in certain ways. So it can be very, very... It's very, very tempting to use a lot of bloom, but the truth is that too much bloom really quickly looks like amateur hour. So avoid doing it. One thing that I find is balancing the threshold is a good idea. So I can put the bloom up, but by increasing the threshold, the only things that actually do bloom are those things that are at a very high brightness level. So see this here? If I was to decrease the threshold, and then slowly increase it, until eventually only some things would actually be blooming. Now obviously that was a bit too hard on this, but it's a good example of where you would go. So I'm going to set this threshold by default to about, I think 2 looks good. So you get a bit of bloom kicking in. If I crank this up, you can see it. If I get a bit of bloom kicking in certain areas, but for the most part my threshold's okay, so that we're not getting it excessively in other areas. I might decrease the threshold just a little bit so this window kind of picks up a nice glow coming from it. But we're still ruling out some of the objects, the other objects that were previously blooming out. So with that done, we're now going to work through some other areas. Things like your size scale control how large the bloom is. So if I do this, I'm just going to set them back to default for a second. If I was to do this and then increase the size scale, you're going to see that it increases the overall blur of the bloom. So if I decrease my size scale, it kind of just confines it to the area pretty close to where it actually is blooming from. But as I increase it, that blur reaches wider and wider and wider and wider. Now, by default, it's at 4. I actually personally kind of prefer it to be at a slightly lower value of around 1 or 2. To each their own, though. So I'm going to set my intensity to 1.5. I'm going to set my threshold to 2. I'm going to keep my size scale a little bit more. Oh wait, threshold 1.5. I'm going to keep my size scale around there. Again, though, if you did want to crank this up, it really kind of depends on the effect that you're after. 3 in this instance, or 4 or 5, is going to give way more of a look of this light kind of billowing out into the room, whereas 1 or 2 is going to kind of keep it more as specifically that source. It's up to you. Now that I'm looking at it, I might actually keep it as 4 for this. So the next part of bloom that we need to really consider is the size and tint. So for this, I've turned up the intensity. It was at 2 before, but I'm just going to crank it up to 15. And I'm going to just show you how some of the sizing works. Essentially, bloom works by doing a bunch of blur passes, one after the other, on top of it. So you can control the size of each blur. So if I pull back to here, and I change the size of the first blur pass, so you can see that the inner rim is switching between being visible and not. So you can really kind of tightly control what you're doing here. If I am going to adjust this, it's usually because I'm turning it down a little bit around that inner rim so you can still see the outline of the shape. When it's at its default, you can see that it's a lot harder to identify it, and instead it's just kind of this blur. So I'm going to turn that down to like 0.5. This works for all the rest of them as well, so again, I can kind of resize these bloom blurs to be the exact size that I want. It's a good idea to actually just use the sliders when you're dealing with this. So I'm just clicking on the number and just kind of dragging until I get the exact kind of bloom that I want. 5. I kind of want this to spread out towards the end, so this is probably going to be, about that. And I'm then going to turn down my intensity until I get back to an area that's a bit friendlier. Now, the other thing that I could do is tinting. So each of these passes can actually be a different color. So what I mean by that is I'm going to turn this up again so you can see what's going on. And I'm going to change my blur to tint from being gray to now being a slight red. You can see as I crank that number up, you can actually see the blur pass itself. But it's a good idea to work out how you want to tint each pass. I typically, when I'm approaching this kind of stuff, would go kind of like a subtle curve in my tints, one after the other. So the first one is going to be grey, but then the next one's going to be blue, and then the next one's going to be a slightly darker blue. Actually, I might just lighten up that first one. So it's kind of like more of an intermediate step between the grey and the blue. And then I'm going to go up to a nice, brighter, almost borderline yellow. And then I'm going to pull that down again to a blue. And it's very, very subtle when you do this, but it does actually change the how the room feels. So with those in, you can see that we have now slightly like a slightly more blue kind of bloom kind of coming out of it. If I was to turn them back to default values, you can see the difference is actually reasonably substantial on some of the areas. Again, if I turn off my blur size, we kind of jump back to this. And if I turn them up, we end up with this. Now, the next thing that I can do here that might be nice is going about the dirt mask intensity. So to use a dirt mask, I've already gone and made one, but essentially what this texture is, I'll load it up so you can see it, is a texture that looks like this. Okay, so they've simulated what would happen, what the screen would look like if there was just some grunge on the lens and just baked it into a texture. Now, once this is done, I can actually turn up my dirt mask intensity. I'm going to set it to 50 as an example so you can see it. You can see it popping in around here. As I'm now looking towards the bloom, we get a slightly more realistic, I guess is the word that I meant to be using here, lens effect kind of going on. Now, this really depends on the kind of overall effect that you're after, and it's a really love or hate kind of a deal. Some people really, really like it, and some people just despise it. I'm personally for it in certain situations. I think it looks really good, especially in areas like where you're simulating like something like Blade Runner or doing that kind of futuristic look. A little bit of grunge on the lens goes a long way. Just finding the right way to use it though is the trickiest bit. Just kind of getting the right amount. One of the issues with getting the grunge looking good as well is that, I mean, when I do it here, the max the slider lets me go is 8, which is a super subtle grunge. And I actually, if I'm going to use it, I'll usually go the whole hog and set it to like 20 or so, 25, at which point it's a bit more visible if we're looking for it, but I think it can look nice in certain situations. So I'm going to leave that enabled for the time being. The other thing that's worth noting is that you can tint it a bit. Now the reason tinting it might be good for you, obviously not in an ArcViz demo, but you know, making it look like there's some green grunge on the screen if you're in the sewers or something might be a bit more appropriate as to, you know, to whatever it is you're trying to do. So I'm going to set this up to be a slightly, pretty much a gray tint. I'm also going to turn my bloom down to where it was before, which was a level of about 1 or 2. That's right for that. Now that we've covered bloom, we're going to move into some more post-processing effects in the next lesson.